The night Sira knelt on cold stone, 250 women had already failed, and not one of them had spilled water on the throne. That was her job. Hauling water, wringing cloth, mopping the places where silk hems dragged through candle wax and ceremonial wine. She had been doing it since before dawn, since the first horns had sounded across the keep, and the candidates had begun arriving in their bone-white gowns, each one stitched with her family's crest at the collarbone, each one perfumed with something expensive enough to make Sira's eyes water from 3 corridors away. She had filled 47 copper tubs that morning. She had scrubbed the antechamber tiles on her hands and knees, while a she-wolf from the northern ridge stepped over her without looking down. She had pressed herself flat against the servants' corridor wall while 2 councilmen passed, arguing about bloodline coefficients, and neither of them had registered her existence even enough to lower their voices. Sira was 23 years old. She had lived inside the walls of Rourke's Keep for 19 of those years, delivered to the kitchen gate in a reed basket with a linen note pinned to her blanket that read only, "Her name is Sira. She has no one." She had been told this story so many times it had lost its sting, the way a word repeated enough becomes just a sound. Foundling, packless, no line. The words sat in her like river stones, smooth and heavy and long since settled. What she did not know, what no one in that echoing stone hall knew, was that before the last candle guttered out tonight, the throne that had stayed dark for 300 years would burn so bright it scorched the dais, and the girl it chose would be the one woman in the room with no bloodline to choose. The mate trial had rules older than the keep itself. Every unmated she-wolf of noble birth between the ages of 20 and 30 could present herself. She would climb the 7 steps to the Luna throne, a seat carved from a single block of moonite, a mineral found nowhere else in the known territories, pale as bone and veined with something that caught light like mercury when it wanted to, and sat dead as chalk when it did not. She would sit. She would place both palms flat on the armrests. She would wait. If the throne recognized her, if it deemed her worthy of the bond, the stone would glow silver white, warm, alive, and the alpha would have his Luna. If it did not, the stone stayed cold, and the candidate descended in silence, and no one spoke of it again. That was the theory. In practice, Sira had watched the ceremony devolve across 12 hours into something closer to a performance. The early candidates had been dignified, composed, their heartbeats barely flickering as they ascended and descended with the grim grace of women who had been prepared for this since girlhood. By midday, the composure had cracked. There were tears. There were whispered prayers. A she-wolf from the eastern marshes had gripped the armrest so hard her claws had extended, leaving pale gouges in the moonite, and 2 guards had to ease her off while she snarled that the throne was broken, that it had to be broken because her grandmother had been Luna and the line was pure. Alpha Rourke had watched it all from his raised platform at the hall's far end, separated from the throne by 30 ft of open stone, and a silence that felt heavier than the distance. Sira had stolen glances at him when her duties brought her close enough to the dais. He sat the way he always sat, one hand loose on the arm of his chair, the other resting on his thigh, his jaw set in that particular way that made the tendons in his neck stand taut. His eyes moved with each candidate, tracking her ascent, her placement, her descent, but his expression gave nothing. He was 31 years old and had held the alpha seat for 9 of those years, the youngest alpha in 4 generations. And the keep's rumor mill had long since established that his patience for the trial was not patience at all, but something closer to controlled fury. 3 years of trials. 3 years of empty thrones and cold stone and councilmen whispering that perhaps the throne's mechanism had simply failed. That perhaps it was time to select a Luna by vote, by treaty, by arrangement. Sira had heard the rumors the way servants heard everything, through walls, through floors, through the gaps in conversations that highborns forgot to seal. The braziers were the council's idea, massive iron bowls of banked coal and aromatic resin positioned at the 4 corners of the hall, ostensibly for warmth and ceremony, practically because Councilman Aldrich had argued that the throne responded to ambient heat signatures, and that raising the hall's temperature might coax a reaction. It was, by any reasonable measure, nonsense, and Sira had seen Alpha Rourke's eyes close for a fraction of a second when the suggestion was made. The kind of micro-expression that only someone accustomed to watching powerful people from the edges of rooms would catch. But he had allowed it. He allowed most of the council's theatrical additions, Sira suspected, because refusing them cost more political capital than the concessions were worth. And because every failed modification was another data point, proving that the council did not understand the throne any better than anyone else. What the braziers actually accomplished, beyond filling the hall with a smell like burnt honey and cedar, was raising the temperature to a degree that made 250 women in layered silk gowns progressively miserable. By the 212th candidate, the hall was sweltering. By the 239th, A she-wolf named Christina from the Silver Lake District fainted on the third step, her body folding sideways in a cascade of white fabric, and the hall erupted in whispered chaos. That was when the steward turned to the servants' line and pointed at Sierra. "You, get her off the steps. Clear the path for the next candidate. We are behind schedule." Sierra set down her water pail. She crossed the 15 ft of open floor between the servants' alcove and the dais in the kind of silence that only came from 19 years of practice at being invisible. She knelt beside Christina, checked her breathing, loosened the high collar that was pressing against her throat. Christina's pulse was strong, her skin flushed but not dangerously hot. Just the heat. Just the absurd, unnecessary, council-mandated heat. Sierra shifted her weight to help lift the unconscious woman, and her left knee slid forward on the polished stone, and her kneecap grazed the base of the throne. The light did not bloom. It detonated, silver white, blinding, a pulse that expanded outward from the throne's base like a shockwave made of moonlight. It hit the braziers and the coals flared and died. It hit the windows and the glass sang, a high, thin note that Sierra felt in the bones of her jaw. It hit the assembled candidates and every single one of them flinched, hands rising instinctively against the glare, and it hit Alpha Rurk, and he was on his feet before the pulse had finished expanding, his chair toppling backward, his eyes locked on the throne with an expression Sierra had never seen on his face and could not immediately name. The stone beneath her knee was warm. Not warm like the braziers, warm like a living thing, like skin, like the sun-baked rocks along the river where she used to sit as a child and press her palms flat and pretend the warmth was someone holding her hand. She looked down. The moonlight was glowing. Every vein in the stone lit from within, mercury bright and pulsing in a rhythm she realized, with a lurch of something between wonder and terror matched her own heartbeat. She tried to pull away. The light held. Not physically, there were no chains, no force, nothing gripping her. But the glow tracked her movement, intensifying where her skin touched stone, dimming where she pulled back. And when she yanked her knee free entirely and scrambled backward on her palms, the light stayed lit. Steady, unwavering, pouring off the throne in waves like heat shimmer. 300 years of silence and the throne was awake. The hall went so quiet Sierra could hear the candle flames guttering in the aftermath of the pulse. Then Councilman Aldrich's voice, high and tight and stripped of every veneer of authority, cut through the silence. "Remove her." The guards hesitated. Aldrich's voice cracked upward. "She is a servant. She touched the throne without authorization. Remove her from the dais immediately." 2 guards moved. They reached for Sierra's arms and the throne pulsed again, a barrier invisible but dense, like walking into a wall of warm water. And both guards stumbled back with their hands pressed to their chests and their eyes wide. The light held. Sierra's heartbeat held. And across 30 ft of open stone, Alpha Rurk descended from his platform with the slow, measured stride of a man who had just been handed the answer to a question he had been asking for 3 years. He stopped at the edge of the barrier. Sierra was still on the ground, her servant's uniform streaked with candle wax and Christina's powder, her hair coming loose from its tie, her hands shaking. She looked up at him and expected the expression she had seen on Aldrich's face, confusion and disgust, wrapped in the frantic energy of a man whose carefully maintained reality was crumbling. Instead, she found something steady, something almost like recognition. Rurk extended his hand, palm up, fingers loose, the way you would reach for something you did not want to fright. The barrier let him through. Sierra watched his hand pass through the shimmer without resistance, watched the light curl around his wrist like a greeting. And the sound that moved through the hall was not a gasp, but something lower, something involuntary, a collective exhale of 250 women realizing at once what this meant. "No," Sierra whispered. It was not a refusal. It was disbelief vocalized. The sound of a woman whose entire identity had been built on the certainty of her own insignificance encountering evidence to the contrary. His hand stayed where it was, steady, patient. His eyes did not leave hers. They were dark, not the poetic dark of stories, but a real dark, brown so deep it looked black in the throne's silver light. And they were asking a question his mouth had not spoken. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers and his skin was warm and rough and real, calloused across the palm from sword work. And the contact sent a current through her that was not magic, or not only magic, but something bodily, something that lived in her pulse and her breath, and the sudden acute awareness of exactly how close he was standing. The throne flared once more, bright enough to cast shadows on the vaulted ceiling, and then settled into a steady glow that held like a heartbeat. He did not let go of her hand. "Everyone out," he said. His voice was low and carried the way alpha voices carried, not through volume, but through a resonance that sat in the chest of every wolf in the room. "The hall is closed." Aldrich stepped forward. "Alpha Rurk, the council must convene immediately to discuss the unprecedented nature of this." And Rourke turned his head, and the look he gave the councilman was not angry, was not threatening, was simply finished in a way that made Aldrich's next word die unspoken. By nightfall, he said, turning back to Sira, you will be under my formal protection. No one touches you, questions you, or approaches you without my direct authorization. The words were spoken to her but aimed at the room. The council filed out. The candidates filed out. The guards filed out. Sira stood in the silver light of a throne that should not have chosen her, her hand in the hand of the most powerful wolf in the territory, and felt the entire architecture of her life rearrange itself around a single, impossible fact. The days that followed were a fever dream stitched from silk and suspicion. Sira was moved from the servants' quarters, a narrow cot in a room she shared with 3 other water carriers, to a suite in the east wing that had its own fireplace, its own bathing room, and windows that looked out over the keep's interior garden. The clothes that appeared in the wardrobe were not hers, but they fit. And that small detail unsettled her more than anything because it meant someone had looked at her, studied her measurements while she was invisible. And she could not decide if the feeling that produced was comfort or surveillance. Macy, the head laundress who had raised Sira from the basket, was the first person allowed through the door, and she arrived with wet eyes and a basket of honey cakes and the particular brand of fierce, weathered love that came from 20 years of caring for a child she had never been given permission to formally claim. My girl, Macy said, holding Sira's face in both hands, her thumbs rough against Sira's cheekbones. You listen to me. You are not what they say you are. You are never what they say you are. Sira covered Macy's hands with her own and felt the familiar calluses, the cracked nails, the warmth that smelled of lye soap and lavender. And for a moment, the silver light and the silk and the impossible throne fell away, and she was just a girl in a laundry, and someone loved her, and that was enough. But it was not enough for the council. Within 48 hours, Councilman Aldrich had convened an emergency session and demanded a bloodline reading, the old ritual in which a court healer drew a vial of blood and ran it through a series of reagents derived from moon night dust, producing a luminescent map of pack ancestry going back 12 generations. The reading was considered infallible. It had been used for centuries to verify claims of noble birth, settle inheritance disputes, and on 3 recorded occasions expose impostors. Aldrich wanted it done publicly, in front of the full court, because he wanted the humiliation to be total when the reading confirmed what everyone already believed, that Sira was a packless orphan with no Luna blood, no latent power, no hidden lineage waiting to be revealed. He wanted the throne's choice to be overridden by biology. He wanted the numbers to do what the barrier had not let his guards do. Rourke allowed it. Sira stood in the council chamber with the court healer's needle in her arm and 200 pairs of eyes on her skin, and she held very still and thought about Macy's honey cakes and breathed. The results came back in 13 minutes. The healer, a quiet woman named Caitlin with steady hands and a reputation for meticulous neutrality, ran the reading twice, then a third time. Then she set the vial down on the table and folded her hands and turned to the council with the expression of someone delivering news that would rearrange the furniture of an entire belief system. The subject's blood is clean, Caitlin said. No pack markers, no dormant Luna lineage, no sealed or suppressed hereditary signatures. She is, genetically and ancestrally, exactly what her records indicate, a foundling of unknown but demonstrably non-pack parentage. Sira felt the words land in her body like stones dropped into still water, each one sending a ring outward through her chest. She had expected this. She had known this. She had lived inside this truth for 23 years. And it should not have hurt to hear it confirmed. But it did, because for 3 days a tiny treasonous part of her had begun to wonder, had begun to construct the secret architecture of maybe. Maybe there was a sealed record somewhere. Maybe her mother had been someone. Maybe the throne had seen a truth her blood had hidden, and now that maybe collapsed. And what was left was what had always been left. Just Sira. No line, no legacy, no cosmic justification for the light. The silence that followed was not the shocked silence of the throne room. It was a calculating silence. The sound of powerful people recalibrating. Aldrich recovered first. Then the throne is malfunctioning, he said. 300 years of consistent operation do not end with a laundress's orphan. I move that we reset the trial and exclude non-pack participants from future proceedings. Rourke had been leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, watching the reading with the same unreadable expression he had worn during the trial. When Aldrich finished, Rourke straightened. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Sira, and his gaze moved across her face with a quality of attention that felt almost tactile, as if he were reading something written on her skin. Then he looked at the council. The throne is not malfunctioning, he said. Aldrich opened his mouth. Rourke continued over him, with the calm, immovable force of a man who had learned long ago that authority was not about volume. Throne chose her. Her blood confirms she has no inherited claim, which means the throne is not measuring bloodline, which means we have spent 300 years filtering candidates by the wrong criterion. The council chamber went very quiet. And the question, Rourke said, is not who she is. The question is what the throne actually sees, and why that question frightens you more than any pretender ever did. He looked at Aldrich when he said it, and Sira watched something move behind the councilman's eyes. Something quick and hunted, and she realized with a clarity that sat cold in her stomach that Aldrich was not confused. He was afraid, not of her, of the answer. The days turned into weeks and the keep became a crucible. Sira was given a tutor, a patient older wolf named Oliver, who had served 3 alphas and who taught her court protocol with a gentle persistence of water-wearing stone. She learned which fork signaled the end of a course. She learned how to address a visiting alpha without implying submission or challenge. She learned that the curtsy she had been performing her entire life as a servant, the deep bend with eyes down, was actually the formal greeting of a bonded Luna to her alpha's court. And that she had been doing it unconsciously for years. And Oliver had looked at her with an expression she could not read when she told him that. Rourke was present in her life, the way weather was present. Pervasive and felt even when not directly visible. He ate breakfast with her in the small dining room that adjoined her suite, arriving each morning with a punctuality that Sira suspected was the closest thing to tenderness his position allowed him. He spoke to her in short, direct sentences, never condescending, never ornamental. He asked about her comfort, her sleep, her appetite, and the questions were simple, but the attention behind them was not. She caught him watching her once. From the far end of the garden. While she was kneeling in the herb bed that Oliver had told her was traditionally the Luna's domain, she had not been planting anything significant, just pulling weeds because her hands needed something to do, and dirt was the only texture in this new life that felt familiar. She looked up, and he was standing by the stone archway with the afternoon light behind him, and his expression was the one she had seen in the throne room, the one she still could not name, and his wolf, his other self, was close to the surface, because his eyes had gone gold at the edges. He turned away when she met his gaze. A small white cat had appeared in Sira's suite on the 3rd night. Slipping through a window she was certain she had closed. It was not a kitten but not fully grown, with one torn ear and fur that was more gray than white, in the places where it had clearly survived something. It curled at the foot of her bed, and purred with a ragged defiant persistence that sounded like a small engine refusing to quit. She named it Thistle, because it had arrived uninvited and prickly, and clung to her with a tenacity that did not care about being wanted. Rourke noticed it during a morning breakfast, and paused with his cup halfway to his mouth, and stared at the animal with a particular expression of a man whose carefully maintained emotional perimeter had just been breached by something too small to fight. Thistle jumped onto the table, and batted his spoon off the edge, and Rourke looked at Sira and something cracked in his composure, just barely, just enough, and the sound he made was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same territory. The attack came on a moonless night 6 weeks after the trial. Sira woke to Thistle's claws in her shoulder, and the sound of the window breaking inward, and a shape in the darkness that moved wrong, too fast, too low, and smelled of the bitter metallic tang she would later learn was ashbane, the only substance that could suppress a wolf's shift, and poison the blood if it reached the heart. She rolled off the bed on instinct, pulling the blanket with her, and the blade that had been aimed at her throat caught the headboard instead, and sank 3 inches into oak. There were 2 of them, masked, gloved, moving with the precision of hired professionals. And Sira had approximately 4 seconds to understand that she was going to die in a silk nightgown, in a room that still did not feel like hers. She screamed, not for help, because her body had never learned to expect help, but in rage, in the furious animal refusal of a woman who had survived 23 years of invisibility, and was not going to be erased in the dark. The door did not open. It ceased to exist. Rourke came through it in a partial shift, claws extended, eyes fully gold. His human form wrapped in the visible tremor of a wolf fighting not to complete the transformation in an enclosed space. He hit the first attacker mid-stride, and the sound was not dramatic, just the blunt, wet crack of a body meeting a wall at speed. The second attacker pivoted towards Sira with the ashbane blade, and Rourke moved between them with a speed that violated what she understood about physics. The blade caught his forearm. He did not flinch. He caught the attacker's wrist and twisted, and the bone broke with a sound like a green branch snapping, and the blade clattered to the floor, and Rourke's other hand was around the attacker's throat, and his claws were dimpling the skin, and his entire body was vibrating with the effort of not killing. Sira touched his back. She did not think about it. She just reached out and pressed her palm flat between his shoulder blades, against the heat of his skin through the torn fabric of his shirt. And she felt the vibration slow. Felt his breath catch, felt something pass between her hand and his body, Not magic, not the throne's light, but a signal older than either. The simple mammalian message of I am here, I am safe, you can stop. His claws retracted. The gold in his eyes dimmed to a ring. He dropped the attacker who crumpled gasping, and turned to her with blood running from the ashbane cut on his forearm. And his voice when he spoke was rough and low. And shaking, "Are you hurt?" It was not a question. It was a demand that the universe deliver the answer he needed. "No," she said, his eyes closed, just for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at the wound on his arm where the ashbane was already working. The skin around the cut turning gray, the blood darkening. And Sarah saw the pain register in the tightening of his jaw, and dropped to her knees and took his arm in both hands and said, "Sit down. Let me see it." In the voice she used to use in the laundry when one of the younger girls burned herself on a pressing iron. And Rourke, Alpha of the Eastern Territories, commander of 1,200 wolves, sat on the edge of her bed and let a foundling girl with no bloodline hold his arm and clean his wound while Thistle settled on the pillow behind him and purred. The investigation traced the attackers to a mercenary company based outside the territory. The payment trail was laundered through 3 intermediaries, but Oliver, whose patient exterior concealed a mind like a steel trap, followed it to a discretionary fund managed by the council's own treasury office. Aldrich denied involvement with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had been denying things professionally for decades. But Rourke had spent 9 years learning to read his counsel the way a hunter reads weather. And the denial sat wrong in the air. Too polished. Too prepared. And when Rourke summoned Sarah to his study 3 days after the attack and told her what Oliver had found, his voice carried a quality she had not heard before. Something colder than anger, older than betrayal. He had trusted Aldrich, not personally, never personally, but structurally. The way an alpha trusts the machinery of governance because the alternative is ruling alone, and ruling alone is how tyrants are made. Aldrich had been his father's councilman, had held Rourke when he was an infant, had spoken the words of investiture when Rourke took the alpha seat at 22 with blood still under his fingernails from the border war that killed his parents. And now, the money that paid for ashbane blades had moved through Aldrich's ledgers. And the question was not whether Aldrich had done it, but how long he had been doing it. How deep the roots went. How many of the throne's 300 years of silence had been silenced by design rather than by fate, because Sarah had begun to wonder. And she could see from the set of Rourke's jaw that he had begun to wonder, too, if the throne measured something other than bloodline. And if the council had controlled which women were allowed to sit it for 3 centuries, then the throne's silence might not have been a failure to find the right candidate. It might have been a success at excluding her. Rourke set a leather satchel on the desk between them. Inside were documents Oliver had pulled from the archive, yellowed and brittle. Predating the current council by 200 years, maintenance records for the throne chamber. And in the margins, in a hand so old the ink had faded to brown, a notation that made Sarah's blood go cold. The throne does not read the blood. It reads the heart. The will to stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. The capacity to hold power without becoming it. All bloodline requirements for candidacy were added by the Third Council 90 years after the throne's creation. And the original selection had been open to any woman willing to sit. The council had not failed to find a Luna for 300 years. The council had been making sure the throne never got to choose one, because a Luna chosen by merit rather than birth could come from anywhere, could owe nothing to the noble families, could not be controlled. Sarah stood in the archive and held the documents in her hands, and felt the weight of 3 centuries of engineered exclusion subtle on her shoulders. She thought about every woman who might have sat that throne, every servant, every healer, every farmer's daughter who had never been allowed to climb those 7 steps. She thought about Macy, who had raised her with nothing and given her everything, and who had never have been permitted within 50 ft of the Luna seat. She thought about the she-wolf from the eastern marshes, who had gouged the armrest with her claws, whose grandmother had been Luna, and who had been told her whole life that the throne was her birthright, when in truth the throne had never cared about birth at all. The old anger was there, the familiar anger of the foundling, the no line, the invisible girl, but layered over it now was something new, something that had the texture of responsibility, because the throne had chosen her, not her blood, not her ancestry, not a dormant power waiting to be unlocked. Her, the girl who hauled water. The girl who loosened Christina's collar on the dais because her first instinct in a crisis was to help. The girl who cleaned Rourke's ashbane wound with laundry-trained hands and did not flinch at the blood. The throne had seen what Macy had always seen, what Rourke had seen when he extended his hand through the barrier. And it was not lineage, it was the willingness to kneel. The instinct to serve not from submission, but from strength. And Aldrich was afraid of that. Because a Luna who had earned her seat by character could not be threatened with the revocation of a bloodline she did not have. She was untouchable in a way no noble-born Luna had ever been. because her claim rested on something the council could not manufacture, could not dilute, and could not breed into a more compliant vessel. Rourke found her in the archive at midnight, sitting on the floor with the documents spread around her and Thistle in her lap, and tears on her face that she had not noticed falling. He sat down beside her on the cold stone floor, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and he did not speak, he just sat with her, and his wolf, the other self she had glimpsed in gold-rimmed eyes and controlled tremors, pressed outward just enough that she felt it, a warmth along her side that was not body heat, but presence. The animal self saying in its wordless way, "I am here, you are not alone, you were never alone." She leaned into him, not dramatically, not with the cinematic grace of the stories she had heard the kitchen girls whisper about. She just tipped sideways, exhausted and heartsick and real, and his arm came around her with a gentleness that contradicted every hard line of his body, and he pressed his mouth to the top of her head and breathed her in. "Stay," he said. It was not a command. It was as close to a plea as an alpha's voice could bend. "I am not going anywhere," she said, and meant it in every direction the words could travel. Aldrich moved on the night of the autumn equinox. He had spent weeks building his coalition quietly, leveraging old loyalties, promising noble families that the bloodline requirements would be reinstated, that the foundling would be removed, that the natural order, the order that kept power flowing through predictable channels, would be restored. He brought 30 wolves loyal to his faction into the keep under the guise of a diplomatic envoy. He brought a relic from the deep archive, a collar forged from ash-bane laced silver that had been used 2 centuries ago to sever a corrupted bond, repurposed now to sever a bond that had never been corrupted at all. He brought certainty, the dangerous, brittle certainty of a man who had maintained a 300-year lie and could not afford to let it crumble. The confrontation happened in the throne room, because Aldrich had a dramatic streak he had never managed to govern. He seized Sarah from her suite while Rourke was dealing with the false envoy at the gates, a distraction that had been timed with military precision, and he dragged her to the dais with 2 guards holding her arms, and the ash-bane collar in his hand. And he stood before the cold throne and began the invocation that would, he claimed, reveal her as unworthy and strip whatever false connection she had forged with the sacred seat. The throne stayed dark. Sarah knelt on the stone with the collar inches from her throat, and felt the cold of the ash-bane radiating against her skin, a cold that went deeper than temperature, that reached into the place where the hum lived. The quiet vibration she had carried since the night of the trial, the steady pulse that matched the throne's light, and Rourke's heartbeat, and her own. Aldrich was speaking. He was using the old words, the formal invocation, and his voice was steady and righteous and absolutely convinced. "You were never meant for this seat. You were never meant for this world. You are in error and I am the correction." The collar touched her skin and Sarah felt something inside her break. Not shatter, break open like a seed, like a door, like the surface of still water when a stone finally reaches the bottom. The light did not come from the throne this time. It came from her. Silver white, pouring from her skin, from her hands, from the place behind her sternum where the hum had lived for 6 weeks. And it was not the throne's power. It was hers. Hers the way her heartbeat was hers, the way her breath was hers, the way every glass of water she had ever hauled and every floor she had ever scrubbed and every bruise she had ever swallowed in silence was hers. The light hit the ash-bane collar and the metal screamed. A high, thin sound like the windows had made the night of the trial, and the collar cracked and fell in 2 pieces to the stone. The light hit Aldrich's guards and they released her and stumbled backward with their hands over their eyes. The light hit Aldrich and he did not fall. He froze, pinned in place by a radiance that was not attacking him but seeing him, illuminating every calculation, every forged record, every candidate he had quietly disqualified over 30 years of managing the trial. Every letter he had written to ensure the throne stayed dark so the council stayed relevant. The light made him visible. Fully, helplessly, completely visible. And visibility for a man who had built his entire career on operating unseen was a worse punishment than any clock could deliver. Rourke arrived at a dead sprint with Oliver and 6 loyal guards behind him and found Sarah standing on the dais in a column of silver light. Aldrich frozen before her, the broken collar at her feet, and Thistle sitting on the throne's armrest cleaning her paw with the serene disinterest of a creature that had always known exactly how this would end. Sarah looked at Rourke. The light was dimming, pulling back into her skin, and she could feel the cost of it already, the exhaustion rolling in like a tide. But she held his gaze and she said the words that had been building in her chest since the night in the archive. "The throne does not measure blood. It measures heart, and they have been keeping the worthy away from it for 300 years. Then her knees buckled and Rourke caught her before she hit the stone, his arms around her, his wolf's growl vibrating through his chest and into hers. And the last thing she felt before the exhaustion pulled her under was his hand cradling the back of her head and his voice low and broken and fierce saying her name like a prayer. She woke in his bed, not hers, his. The realization arrived in layers. First the scent. Cedar and iron and something warm underneath that she had been cataloging unconsciously for weeks. Then the weight of the furs, heavier than the ones in her suite. Then the sound of breathing that was not hers, steady and deep and close. Rorik was sitting in a chair beside the bed, still in the clothes he had worn to the throne room, blood on his sleeve from a fight she had not witnessed, his head tipped back against the chair and his eyes closed. Asleep but barely. The kind of sleep that sits on the surface like oil on water, ready to break at the slightest disturbance. Thistle was on his lap. The cat had arranged herself with the imperious comfort of a creature who had decided that this particular human was acceptable furniture, and one of Rorik's hands was resting on her back. His fingers curled loosely in her fur, and Sierra looked at the image, the exhausted alpha and the battered cat, and felt something vast and simple move through her chest. She said his name. Kale, his first name. The one she had heard Oliver use once and had been carrying in her mouth since. Waiting for the right moment to speak it. His eyes opened. Gold at the edges, then brown, then just him, awake and aware and looking at her with the expression she could finally name. It was not recognition. It was relief. The relief of a man who had been searching for 3 years and had found what he was looking for in the last place anyone would have looked. And it was awe. The awe of a man confronting the reality that the woman in his bed had just broken an Ashbane collar with her bare will and illuminated 3 centuries of corruption, and was now looking at him with bed head and sleep-creased cheeks and asking in a voice still rough with exhaustion, "Is Aldrich contained?" He stared at her for a moment. Then he made the sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same territory. "Yes," he said. "Oliver has him in the lower cells. He has been talking since dawn trying to trade information for exile." Sierra pushed herself upright against the headboard. "Exile is too gentle," she said, and then paused because she heard the hardness in her own voice and did not recognize it. "No, exile is appropriate. Let him live with visibility. Let every territory know what he did. That is worse than a cell for a man like him." Rorik's gaze shifted, deepened. Something moved behind his eyes that was all wolf. Possessive and proud and desperately tender. He leaned forward. His hand found hers on the fur. "Sierra," he said, and the way he said it made her name sound like a territory he was asking permission to enter. "I need you to understand something. The throne chose you, but I am not asking you to stay because of the throne. I am asking you to stay because you cleaned my wound when I was bleeding and did not flinch. Because you pulled weeds in the garden with your hands in the dirt and looked more at home than any Luna who ever held court. Because you named a stray cat Thistle and loved her like she mattered, and she does matter, and so do you, and I am not. I have never been good at," and his voice cracked just barely, just enough. And his wolf pressed forward and his eyes went gold. And the word that came out was not spoken in his human voice, but in the other one. The deeper one. The one that bypassed language entirely. "Mate," Sierra's snorts breath caught, not because the word surprised her. Because it settled, like a stone reaching the bottom of still water, like a key in a lock she had not known she carried. She lifted her hand and touched his jaw, the hard line of it, the place where the tendon stood taut, and she felt it relax under her fingers for what she suspected was the first time in 9 years. "Yes," she said, and the word was simple and absolute, and it was enough. He kissed her, not the way she had imagined kisses from the kitchen girls' whispered stories, not theatrical. Not frantic, he kissed her like he was memorizing her, slow, deliberate, his hand sliding into her hair, his thumb tracing the curve of her ear, his mouth warm and careful, and shaking slightly with the effort of being gentle when every line of his body was made for force. She pulled him closer. The chair scraped. Thistle yowled in indignation and leaped off his lap and stalked to the end of the bed, and neither of them noticed. He broke away just far enough to breathe. His forehead rested against hers. His eyes were closed and his lashes were dark against his cheeks, and he was trembling. "Tell me to stop," he said. "And I will," she answered by pulling him onto the bed. 7 months later, Sierra stood in the garden she had been weeding the day Rourke first watched her from the archway. The herb beds were full now, rosemary and sage, and a sprawling lavender plant that Thistle liked to sleep in, emerging each evening dusted purple and smelling like a sachet. The throne room had been open to all women of the territory, regardless of birth or pack status, and the Luna Trials, renamed simply the Seat of Seeing, had already identified 3 women from non-noble backgrounds whose gifts the old system would have buried. One was a healer from the Northern Ridge. One was a teacher from the border settlements. One was a 12-year-old girl named Lily, who had sat on the throne during a public demonstration and made it glow so bright the entire keep had seen it through the windows, and who had then asked Sierra, with the breathless, run-on chatter of a child who has just discovered she is extraordinary, "Does this mean I get to help people? Because I have always wanted to help people. My mother says I help too much, but I do not think you can help too much, do you?" Sierra had knelt in front of her and taken her hands and said, "No, you cannot help too much," and meant it with every molecule of her foundling, packless, no-line body. Rourke found her in the garden at dusk, the way he often did, drawn by a pull he had stopped trying to rationalize and started simply following. He stood in the archway and watched her for a moment, and his wolf settled in his chest with a low, satisfied hum. And then he crossed the garden and sat beside her on the stone bench and pulled a small carved figure from his pocket. It was a wolf, no larger than his thumb, whittled from moonite, and it glowed faintly in his palm, warm as skin. He set it in her hand. "For the collection," he said. It would join the growing row of small carvings on the windowsill of what was now their shared bedroom. One for every week since the equinox, each one a different animal. Each one slightly lopsided because an alpha's hands were better suited to swords than whittling, and he refused to let anyone else make them. Sierra turned the figure in her fingers and felt the warmth of the stone and the warmth of the man beside her and the warmth of the secret she had been carrying for 11 days, waiting for the right moment. She set the wolf down on the bench between them. "You might need to make smaller ones soon," she said. He looked at the wolf, then at her, then back at the wolf. His processing speed, so devastating in combat and council, failed him entirely. "Smaller," he repeated. She took his hand and placed it flat against her stomach and watched comprehension arrive on his face like sunrise, slow and then all at once. And the sound he made was not the almost laugh. It was something she had never heard from him before. It was joy, unguarded and total, cracking through every layer of restraint he had ever built. And his arms came around her, and he lifted her off the bench and held her against his chest. And his wolf howled, not with his throat, but with his whole being. A sound that resonated through the bond and through the keep and through the garden where the lavender trembled, and Thistle opened one eye from her purple nest and closed it again, unimpressed, as she had always been by the dramatics of wolves. Sierra pressed her face into his neck and breathed him in and felt the hum in her chest, steady and sure. The same hum the throne had answered on the night 250 women failed, and a foundling's knee grazed the stone. And she thought about what the throne had seen, not blood, not power, not destiny, but the willingness to kneel for someone else's sake, the strength to stand in your own light, even when every voice in the room says you have no right to shine. And she held her mate and carried their child and knew, with the settled certainty of a stone at the bottom of still water, that she had always been enough. So, what would you rate this story from 1 to 10? Let us know in the comments. And if it hit you the way it hit us, go ahead and subscribe. We have stories coming that will make you laugh, cry, and stay up way past your bedtime, and we do not want you to miss a single one. Hit that bell so you never miss an upload, and we will see you in the next one.